I'm happy to be back. It's been a while. And I'm just coming back from lovely Ecuador, so bear with me because I still have quite some jet lag. And I'm happy to present to you the study today, which I worked on last summer. It is, as opposed to what Max presented, which was more of a macro study, this goes more into detail. It's a case study of Baltnews Telegram, of the Baltnews Telegram channel. And I am looking at information laundering as a method of deceitful messaging, deceitful information transmission. And yeah, let's start. So the aim of the study was to investigate whether information laundering as a hybrid deception technique is used or was used in the context of the Ukraine war up until end of June, and especially with view to a Baltic audience, and to refine the information laundering research method. The Baltnews channel was chosen because it allows to study a Baltic audience, so information that is directed towards a Russian-speaking Baltic audience, and it has been found to function as a program and news website in the past, as I'm sure a lot of you know. So it constitutes the most likely case, if you like. But ultimately, the study does go beyond just looking at Telegram, because the channel functions as a gateway, so to say, to point to cases of information laundering and track the wider network of other websites engaged. And I argue this to be a quite systematic way of tracking information laundering. And I hope I'll convince you. The data I looked at is posts of the Baltnews Telegram channel that I analyzed from 1st December last year to, 1st December before the war to 30 June last year. And I especially analyzed those posts that contained external links, so links to external websites. And I traced the network of websites spreading those posts with information laundering techniques or features. Now, I won't bore you with the details of the concept yet, but here's the general definition first of information laundering, or how we understand it, and we will later see how it actually translates into different techniques of message amplification. So in the process of information laundering, a network of intermediaries like news websites apply techniques to gradually distort or manipulate an original piece of information from a previous source, and then this manipulated information gets transmitted further. And here you can see some descriptive data of the Baltnews Telegram channel, which indicates that Baltnews sits in, or is linked to Russian and programmed and Telegram news channels, and some of which are Russian state-funded, like Sputnik, RT, RIA Novosti. And the right graph demonstrates the growth of subscribers of the Telegram channel following 24 February. Now, I looked at over 1,200 Baltnews Telegram posts which referenced websites, and I was especially interested in the 30% that linked to news articles, because in essence, information laundering describes a set of techniques used to pretend that a certain content was spread by media A while it was not, or not quite. So if you like, it's basically a false flag operation in the information sphere. Yeah, and interestingly, over a quarter of the articles that the channel referenced to after 24 February were also referenced by Kremlin official media, which already indicates a certain connection. And yeah, quick note on terminology. Kremlin official or Russian state-sponsored media, I mean Kremlin or Russian military websites, state-funded media like Первый канал, RIA Novosti, RT, or Sputnik. Now, to the case studies, I looked at two sets of cases. So cases referring to Western news outlets and showing traces of information laundering, and then cases in which the channel directly referenced Kremlin official media articles. And then I did not only map the network of the media sites taking part in this information laundering, but also the themes or strategic narratives. So I went a bit more into the content of those posts. Now, before getting to an example, this is some detail of how to actually identify information laundering cases in practice. So firstly, laundered news items can pertain to different phases of information laundering. We can conceptualize information laundering as a process from placement to layering and integration. So first, an information laundering attempt is placed, meaning a manipulated news item. Then it is layered by being spread by different websites, and then it might be integrated into another information environment or reach more renowned news websites or outlets. And connections between those items can be established if they have been published in close succession, or the authors are the same, their content is structurally similar, they reference each other. And one then seeks to identify the different techniques used to manipulate information, and you can see a list of the techniques identified in the case studies here. Most of them are quite self-explanatory, like deceitful translation, disinformation or misleading headline. With misappropriation, I mean references are provided that do not contain the alleged information, or unrelated information is incorporated to reframe an event. Potemkin Village is a network of deceptive fact-producing platforms that endorse each other's content. Smurfing means the same actor controls various accounts or websites disseminating information. Woozle effect means fabricated or misleading citations. So these techniques are not mutually exclusive. They do overlap to some extent. So a misleading headline could also include disinformation, for example. But what this study found was that misappropriation is a necessary condition for information laundering, because the main feature of information laundering is misrepresenting the original information. Now, coming to one example. This is an example of an information laundering case from 13-14 June, where first the Bloomberg article was sort of taken, and the likelihood of the EU to collapse as a consequence of Ukraine joining it was exaggerated. And this attempt was placed by RIA Novosti, then layered by 24 websites, and integrated into Baltnews on the Baltnews website, but then also on Baltnews Telegram, which is how I found it. Now, the information laundering techniques comprise misleading headlines. So the Baltnews Telegram headline states, with reference to Bloomberg, that if Ukraine, Georgia, and Albania are accepted into the EU, the organization will collapse. But the original article did not state this. And the decontextualization, so all outlets identified leave out the information that the Bloomberg article also proposes a phased integration instead. And some misappropriation and disinformation is also found. So some websites include that Bloomberg predicts the collapse of the EU without Ukraine, adding that the Eurozone will fall apart like the Union itself. So we can see how the information gets twisted around. And then, interestingly, there was also a case of smurfing, so a bunch of websites, about 8 websites, with the same security certificate from Gazeta Ru also posted this news item. And this whole attempt plays into the theme of divided West in political crisis, so really stresses that the EU is divided over Ukraine potentially joining it. Now, zooming out a bit to what I found overall concerning these information laundering attempts, a majority of them manipulated news from English language news outlets with large online readership like Bloomberg, The Washington Post, The Hill, The Independent, Foreign Policy, but also some German news outlets like FAZ, Heute, Krone, Welt, ZDF. And the outlets most involved in sharing these attempts, which is not very surprising, are Sputnik, RIA Novosti, RT, Gazeta Ru, and Nosmir Lenta Ru. And the most popular techniques we can see are misappropriation, misleading headlines, outright disinformation. And interestingly, over time, the number of Kremlin official articles that shared information laundering cases more than doubled, just like the number of Russian domain websites involved, which reflects an overall increase of information laundering attempts. Yes, so the results show that the Baltnews Telegram channel did help to distribute pro-Kremlin information attempts, potentially to render the content more credible. But interestingly, in no case the Baltnews Telegram itself placed any attempt, so they're just drawing on what other pro-Russian media are spreading. Now, concerning the cases in which Baltnews directly linked to Kremlin official articles, there was an increasing number of posts directly linking to them. So this messaging was increasingly overtly spread, which is also not super surprising. The outlets referenced the most were RIA Novosti, Sputnik, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and RT. But when directly referencing these articles, I argue that this is not actually a case of information laundering because Baltnews simply repeated the content. There were sometimes some misleading headlines or even little pieces of disinformation, but the idea was still to spread the original Kremlin content further and not sneak in its own messaging. So a short summary before I run you quickly through the second part of the study. In this first part, we saw that there still was information laundering and even increasing information laundering that we could see through the Baltnews Telegram channel, which might indicate that this is more widely the case, not only in this channel. And I'm arguing that information laundering is actually the best frame to describe what we're seeing. It could also be pro-Kremlin media systematically drawing off and amplifying content of the Western press that can be made to align with its own messaging, but I'm arguing because it's a quite systematic attempt of a network of different websites that use similar techniques and post structurally similar content in close succession, that this is actually information laundering. And it might be curious to see this more covered technique alongside the very overt pro-Kremlin messaging, which might point to either the audience which this messaging tries to reach, such as Russian-speaking Baltnews audience, so trying to fight the idea of people who also consume some other Western media, or it might hint at a way the Kremlin tries to, or Russian state-sponsored media tries to evade, circumvent sanctions and still spread its messaging. Yes. Now, we're zooming out, and I'll sprint through the second part, just on the surface. So in addition to analyzing the information laundering techniques, I also looked more at the content of the Baltnews Telegram posts, looking at biases based on the assumption that biases can of course contribute to audience manipulation. And as for coverage bias, over 80% of the posts of the channel since 24 February referred to the Ukraine war. And to identify framing biases, I looked at the themes, and as you can see, they're quite similar to what Victoria's found in the Debunk EU presentation. The orange bars pertain to the cases of information laundering in the linked to Western news articles, and the gray ones to outright pro-Kremlin messaging or Kremlin official media. And you can see that the orange ones stress the theme of the divided West in political crisis, the weak West and strong Russia, whereas the pro-Kremlin messaging focuses more on stressing Russophobic tendencies in the West, the aggressive West, deceptive West, and racist West. What I did then was looking at the co-occurrence of themes to find some patterns, and we can find two sets of strongly co-occurring themes, one stressing the strengths of Russia, weakness of the West political crisis and the West being deceptive, and the second stressing the West being racist or fascist and Russophobic, forgetting its Nazi past, and with a pinch of Soviet nostalgia. Overall, we see an anti-Western pro-Kremlin framing bias with, a clear inclination towards the negative. And it can be, I would argue, expected that this way of presenting information is then received and incorporated into individual belief systems. But more research is warranted on these psychological effects, and I would say that Aidan Hoyle is actually doing some very promising research in this direction. Now, the intention behind Baltnews messaging would be nice to further investigate, and the antagonistic strategic narratives research framework of Wagenson and Barzanian, which Hoyle also adopted, is interesting for this matter. So they define antagonistic strategic narratives as narratives dispersing critical or hostile information about another political actor to inflict harm. And interestingly, the most important themes of cases A versus B seem to follow different antagonistic strategic narratives. So the A cases linked to Western media, they, especially the theme of the deceptive political crisis, West plays into a distraction narrative, so amplifying portrayals of disorder and internal division, arguably to diminish the perception of Western states' strength and governmentality and to harm their image as attractive partners. Whereas for cases B, so outright amplification of Kremlin official media, the most prominent themes, especially that of the Russophobic West, plays into the suppression narrative, presenting Western states' way of life, leadership, and population as morally deviant, and emphasizing liberal or non-traditional values to impair the West's moral image. So this might be a way to sort of look a bit behind these themes and the intention of how they might be aimed at affecting the target audience. Yeah, this was just a sneak peek, but you can look into the paper, into the study, if you want to read a bit more of the analysis. As a conclusion, overall, I found that information laundering is still used as a technique in parallel to this very overt pro-Kremlin messaging. The themes transported reflect broader antagonistic strategic narratives, and the information attempts reached the Baltnews Telegram channels, so they potentially had an influence on the Baltic audience, or on part of the Russian-speaking Baltic audience. And so Telegram was potentially a helpful vehicle to evade sanctions on Russian media and still offer access to pro-Kremlin messaging, like our virtual manipulation brief also showed, as Max presented. So yeah, this was a way to, as an example of how the public will and opinion might be forged. Yes, thank you, and I'm happy to receive your questions.
Thank you so much, Marta. Super insightful. Do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I've already introduced myself. I was wondering, did you come across any counter-information laundering operations as part of your investigation, and how do you think we can counter information laundering? Do you have any ideas on that?
I didn't look into this, but it's actually very interesting idea. Just trying to picture how one might do that. Let's discuss after.
Anybody else? Or maybe any ideas about how to counter information laundering? Okay, all right, Marta, thank you so much. Thank you, really great presentation.
Thanks.